Hello and welcome to The Game is About Glory. My name is Steff and joining me are Gareth and Milo. Hello chaps, it's been a while. How are you?
Hello again.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Wow, crazy. Well, it's wonderful to see you both again. Look, happy holiday season, guys, first of all, to you both. I know we're at the beginning of it, so I'd like to extend my holiday greetings to you both.
Season's greetings to you as well.
Excellent, thank you. And season's greetings to everyone who is listening around the world to usher in the start of those wonderful couple of weeks where everyone sits around, has parties and does fuck all. No, I'm not talking about a typical fortnight in the current British government calendar. We, at The Game is About Glory, would like to give you a pre-Christmas sweetener. Instead of some early gold, frankincense or myrrh, which, chaps, I learned earlier this week from that bastion of truth and goodness, the mighty Dame Edna Everage, can actually be used to treat syphilis, believe it or not, myrrh. I didn't know that. We will be bringing you Spurs in the Tens, the latest in our look back at modern Spurs decades. We've done Spurs in the 90s and the noughties, so this is part 3 in a trilogy. And look, I can't promise that part 3 of this trilogy will treat the sort of ailments that Myrrh does, but we can promise you that it is going to be a treat. And given that this is the holiday season, we're skipping the week that was because we might have recorded this episode in advance to allow us more time with our feet up, quaffing all sorts of holiday food and booze in the pre-Christmas warm-up. It also means we're faking taking a week off, but we aren't really. And shall I just shut up, guys?
Let's move on.
I'm waffling too much. Yeah, okay. So,
should this be Spurs in the Tens or Spurs in the Teens? I'm not quite sure.
I think it's the Tens, isn't it? Because otherwise we'd be excluding the first couple of seasons.
Okay.
Spurs in the Tens it is. I have nothing. I have nothing to say. But listeners to a recent pod of ours, quite possibly last week's, will have noticed that we were onto the fence depth there. You get nothing but accuracy with us at The Game is About Glory. And that's obviously one of the many reasons you listen to us, isn't it? And you also listen to us for our dynamic analysis of these decades. And so here we go with Spurs in the Tens. It says in the notes, let's kick off with an easy one. What was it like being a Spurs fan in the Tens? Which is quite possibly the most complicated question I think we could start with. So try and break that down. In 30 seconds, 3, 2, 1. Gareth.
Certainly compared to supporting Spurs in the 90s and 2000s, it was a wonderful time to be a Spurs fan in the 2010s. And just looking at the average league position was 4th. That season, we were getting up and around 70 points on average most seasons. We were consistently beating Arsenal. We were recording wins against everyone else, which hadn't been a feature of the 2 decades that preceded it as well. So I would say that following Spurs in there, you actually felt relevant for the first time in probably a generation.
Yeah, I'd say this was probably the best time to be a Spurs fan since the early 80s. Early mid-80s. So, obviously the previous decade, we'd turned things around, from that kind of when Martin Jol came in, we were on the uppers, and I think we kind of build on that here. We start the decade in the Champions League for the first time, which is kind of the next question. And, we're lucky enough, actually. I mean, firstly, as the decade goes on, we've got our best kind of modern manager coming into the club halfway through this decade. And we've got some great players to talk about here. You think at the beginning of this, when we kick off this decade, we've got Luka Modric and Gareth Bale, who are 2 of the best players the world has seen since then. We're really spoiled. When we go through these players, this list of players we've got for this period, and Bale and Modric aren't in our best, aren't in the best team we've got this decade. And we were spoiled for players this decade, really were.
Look, I agree with everything you've both said. The caveat to it for me is that it also it reintroduced me to levels of vertigo and pain that I thought would be impossible, having gone through some of the previous decades we have talked about with Tottenham Hotspur Football Club. I thought I'd seen it with 1980 through to 85, 86. I thought that was it. And I was sort of almost, I won't say content, that's wrong, but I was almost resigned to mediocrity. And then this was the decade where we were anything but mediocre. We were for 2 years, as we'll get into it, the best club in the Premiership. If they'd given the Premier League title over 2 seasons instead of each season between 2016 and 2018, we would have been champions. That's been statistically proven. And look, there was that game at the end of the decade which broke my heart. I mean, it broke my heart, and I will never be the same. So, it is.
Don't go there yet. Let's build to that.
No. It is, but it is all about, as you say. I mean, it was about glory, but also daring to do all of it. I mean, it all came together in this decade, didn't it?
I'm in danger of blurring us into the next question here. But
that's fine. Go for it. Blur us into it.
If you go back a decade, so before we'd really started that climb, and we're still kind of recovering from kind of the underinvestment of the sugar era and all of that stuff, and there was a Champions League cartel, wasn't there? There was a kind of 4 clubs who had the Champions League places locked on, and it looked to me like we were never going to get in there.
Agreed.
And even kind of, when we qualified for the the UEFA Cup under Jol, that felt like a huge achievement from where we'd been.
Agreed.
And as we go into this decade, the Champions League games, I remember going to kind of the early games at the Lane, going with my mate, and we that first home Champions League game, we walked in saying we're going to enjoy this because it might never happen again. That's kind of how I felt.
No, you're absolutely right. And the spill on, I mean, just to touch back to where we left the last review, I mean, I remember celebrating like an absolute bastard after the Crouch Fest. And I remember looking and taking it in and thinking, Man City are going to be here again and again and again, because you knew the money was there. And it was like, we've got to enjoy this because this may not happen again. So I'm absolutely with you on that feeling. And we are, it's so true.
If when we qualified, someone had given you the script and talked about those Inter Milan games and everything like that, you would have gone, yeah, of course I'll have that, It's like...
Yeah. I mean, and we are, look, I have by the way, chaps, as listeners know, we have detailed notes and we like to sort of go in flow. But, if we break the lines here, this is what Spurs in the 10s was all about. It was about breaking the lines and daring to do. So let's dare to do. And if you want to blur a topic, go for it. What are the memories of this period in that first Champions League campaign, under Harry Redknapp? Look, Harry was our manager. Rafa van der Vaart. I mean, we're talking about some exciting talent. Gareth.
Well, you mentioned Van der Vaart there, and that was going to be my first reference point. But every transfer
I knew that.
window,
that's why I beat you to it. Sorry.
Every transfer, or at least every final day, or even every final hour of every transfer window since then, is benchmarked against that one in 2010 when it turned out about a minute before 11 o'clock at night that there was this possibility that we were about to sign this bloke who played in the World Cup final for Holland a few months. I mean, it's not quite on the Klinsmann scale of 1994, but it's probably about as close as we've got since then in terms of just that audacity and the unexpectedness of us signing this world-renowned player who began to symbolise everything that was right about sort of Spurs DNA. He was that sort of mercurial talent that he wasn't a consistent performer, but he would go on to score so many memorable goals for us. And he was the rapport that he developed with the fans very, very quickly it became really clear quite quickly that he was going to develop that sort of relationship. But that for me is the starting point of this decade.
Yeah, I mean, those Redknapp teams, particularly at this period, and I think all these managers, we have to talk about how it ended because, Redknapp, AVB, Poch, they're all pretty, different, but all pretty heartbreaking in how they ended. But during this period, Redknapp, it was really fun. It was fun to go and watch us. We weren't the most sophisticated team in the world. We weren't the most tactically astute. You do get the feeling that it was, to quote Harry, go out there and run about a fucking bit. There was that approach. But he had some really, really good players, and
he made some really brave decisions as well, right? I mean, could anyone else have got away with bringing Emmanuel Adebayor into Spurs? I mean, nobody else I can think of would have got away with it, but he just sort of cheek and charmed his way, and made it work. And earlier we have, Super Pavlyuchenko. I mean, he just seemed to make everyone feel like they belonged at our club to the fans. He challenged my football hypocrisy. There's no doubt, because I did not like him before he arrived. I'll be blunt about that. But he did carry on what Martin Jol did in terms of making you feel happy to be a Spurs supporter and part of it, right? I mean, he had a good manner.
Gareth, I think you said before that you're very fond of him, aren't you, as a manager? You enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did for the reasons that you said there. You went to games and you enjoyed them. I've got very, very fond memories of him as our manager. I think, as we'll go on to talk about, when he left, it was the right time for him to go. But certainly in the 4 years of service that he gave us, they were fantastic memories. I really do think that he understood the fabric of the club. And he'd never professed to be a Spurs fan when he was growing up, and his allegiances were, well, most famously with West Ham. I think he probably grew up as an Arsenal fan, but he grew up in an era where he remembered those Bill Nicholson teams of the 60s, and I think he understood the DNA of the club. So for him, you talk about making brave decisions. For me, when we were chasing down that Champions League spot the season before that, he decided, I'm going to put Lennon on the right, Bale on the left, and I'm going to put Modric and Huddleston in the middle. What a aesthetically pleasing midfield that is. And he worked on the basis, look, they're good players, they'll keep the ball and they won't give it away, and they'll create more chances than we'll give up.
His press conferences, or when he talked to press, was great though, wasn't it? When you look back, and look, in fairness, I'm looking back at this with a nostalgic, warm lens, and at the time, he frustrated me a little bit, I have to be honest. But
yeah, no, I always felt his dealings with the press were a bit cringe. It's with Harry, it's always about Harry, isn't it? And he's very, very focused on kind of building the myth, building the legend, and as you know, he's probably the last or one of the last of that lineage, isn't he? I mean,
yes,
not dissimilar to Venables in many ways, and not quite as smooth, but again, always got his eye on something else. You wouldn't really trust them, would you? Particularly, but
no,
but
certainly not.
But also, if you give them a platform, they're going to use it to try and build their own legend. But the payoff for that is that they're very good at connecting with players. They can build that relationship, build the rapport. The players who played for them really liked them, and they could get players to go on the pitch and just be 6 inches taller and half a yard faster because and free to express themselves because they trusted them and they had that relationship. And as man managers, that there's definitely a skill there.
Well, he was most certainly a man manager. I doubt he was the greatest tactician in the world. Obviously, he
Definitely
knows
not.
his game. I mean, he knows his game. There's no two ways about that. But he did come with, Kevin Bond was there with him, and
there's
Joe
no
Jordan
sign of him ever being
doing
able to
his
pass
bit.
any of that off to his son. So I'm not so sure.
Yeah, but he did have his assistants who did, and Joe Jordan, you felt, was very heavily involved in some of the more tactical elements. But yeah, you're right. I mean, look, there are friends of mine who will be listening to this podcast and will be listening to my slightly warm reflection on Harry Redknapp and saying, "You total bullshitter! He infuriated you at times during that, and he did." When he sort of talk about running about a bit, as you've referenced, Gareth, and look, talking about another Gareth, I was always extremely frustrated at how much credit he claimed for Gareth Bale. I mean, certainly he should claim some credit, but it should not be forgotten that he wasn't sold on him for a while. And I'd love to know who actually truly suggested that that he not be played as a left back. I think it's pretty common knowledge that Daniel Levy pushed hard to keep Bale at the club at the time. So look, Harry comes with his blemishes, but it has to be said, maybe we should move to the 2012 season, the season that he left. Left at the end of that season. I'll start by saying it's got to be the most frustrating season of all of them, I think, in terms of we were blowing everyone away up until Christmas, and then Fabio Capello decides to put his small shoes to rest, leave the England job, and chaps, take it away.
Well, I think you've actually missed something out, because before that you've got the court case over his tax affairs.
Yes, well called.
And
yep.
I think what most smarted about him openly pursuing the England job was that we'd stuck with him through some pretty iffy dealings, and he was clearly that was a distraction. And then John Terry does a racism, Capello gets the sack, and then Harry's fluttering eyelashes at the FA at every opportunity. And I think if the former hadn't happened, the latter probably wouldn't have hurt as much. And I think the other thing
that's an excellent point, and you're absolutely right, because I remember the sequence of events, and you're so right. Yes,
it's the consequence rather than the cause, isn't it?
And I think the other thing is that the man he lost out to for the job, Hodgson, wasn't flirting with the FA for the job. He was getting on with his job.
That almost, when you look back and you say that, the man he lost out to the job with Roy Hodgson, that's almost like a fuck you from the FA, if you think about it at the time.
But to be fair, they were probably right. Redknapp, in a press conference as the England manager,
wow. Yeah.
You know, he would have been an absolute bloody nightmare.
He would have been the Duke of Edinburgh job for sure. I mean, we're getting into personalities versus there for sure. That would have cost him, yeah. But anyway, you continue with your review of that era because you're nailing it.
No, let Gareth go because I think I've said what I've got to say about that particular incident. But
yeah. Well, I felt that our season fell apart that year. Even before that, we had that game up at Man City in January where we'd been on that fantastic run, and I'm not sure we would have gone ahead of them or gone top had we won there, but it would have been a real statement because this was Manchester City. I suppose that's another really important context just to drop in here for this decade, that the money came into Man City like properly in 2008. So by the start of the decade is when they are spending huge money on players who wouldn't have gone anywhere near them.
Yeah.
So Aguero being the obvious one that season, and Balotelli. So we went to Manchester City in late January, went 2-0 down, and then had an inspired comeback. Defoe and Bale scored. And then we had, talking about matter of inches, that moment when Bale pulled the ball across the front of the 6-yard box and Defoe missed it by a long stud away that would have put us 3-2 ahead. Then Balotelli, who should have been sent off
the stand,
kicked Scott Parker in the head. He then wins the penalty that he scores from to give Manchester City the win there. And it felt like that moment, if you're looking at sliding doors moments of that season, I think had we won at City that day, the rest of the season may have been very different, notwithstanding the other macro conditions that were going on.
That's interesting. And look, I know we're not going to be breaking this down season by season for everyone, but this is a very important phase of the Tens. I think that Harry Redknapp's tenure, so I think it does deserve another 5 minutes. I would say that the sliding doors moment for me was beating Newcastle 5-0 and Harry drinking the ether of what a smooth and brilliant side we were, and subsequently going to Arsenal and actually setting us up in the most disgraceful way. And just really not preparing us properly. And I couldn't help at the time but think, well, this is a guy who's distracted, who's also having his pillow fluffed by everyone. He's having it fluffed by Spurs. He's having it fluffed by England. And I just thought he's taken his eye off the ball. And I am still to this day furious at that defeat. That defeat really cost us everything that season. And it remains one of the angriest I've ever been at a manager for fucking up a game. And I believe he did.
I think one of the things with Redknapp is that obviously he's always had a load of mates in the media who will call for, certainly always called for him and always kind of sung his praises. And he quite often played to that. And, he clearly liked that kind of adjuration. There's a lot of there's basically a load of old hammers, aren't there, in the, or West Ham fans working in Fleet Street and,
like your initial
media.
Description. A load of old hammers. It's got a nice ambiguity about it.
And, he always played up to that. And, I think he's probably a bit guilty of believing his own myth sometimes.
I'm just going to throw in there, the game you're talking about was the game back end of February when we went to Highbury. They were really on the ropes before that game, and it really looked like we were going to overtake them. This was the Mind the Gap game, wasn't it?
Yes.
So you'll remember the season before, the 10-11 season, we went to Highbury and were 2-0 down at half time, and really it could have been 5. And I think I was watching that game at the time thinking, just bring on another midfielder for a forward. Let's shut it down and let's make sure we're not humiliated here. But Harry took off a midfielder and put Defoe on, and we won 3-2 that game. And that's still the last time we've won a Premier League game at Arsenal, only once in 30 years. So this was the next fixture we played there. So you can understand from his perspective, I think, well, this worked for me last year at Arsenal. This is the way to take them on. It's to really have a go at them. And in fairness, we were 2-0 up in 10 minutes and their fans were booing. Some of them were probably leaving. I don't know that it was his fault that we then conceded one crucially just before half time and then a second one within stoppage time and then went on to lose 5-2. I think the cast was probably set by that point.
And, that was the season as well. I do remember we ended up with our destiny back in our own hands. We just needed to win our final 2 games. He blew it at Aston Villa, leaving Jermaine Defoe on the bench. And so the season was done. Harry was done. I think what truly cooked his goose with us was talking so much about wanting a new contract at the time that Daniel Levy was, I believe, sitting shiva for a family bereavement. I remember that. I remember reading the timing, and I was thinking, this is a terrible thing. You're really being very foolish to do this now. And that was that, wasn't it? Off he went.
I think the other thing is that AVB was out there, and I think AVB is a lot closer to what Levy wanted in a manager. And I think, as we go on, apart from, if we look at AVB, and I think Poch is actually what Levy thought he was getting in AVB.
Mm-hmm.
I think that kind of younger, tactically astute manager who can bring through younger players and play progressive modern football, I think is what it was always his ideal. I don't think Redknapp ever would have come to the club in any other circumstances than he did. And you basically, as the decade goes on, we've got what I think is kind of Levy's ideal type of manager, what he thinks he wants, and then it's kind of this bookended with
yes,
yeah.
There's no two ways about the accuracy of that. It's 100% because he bought in Redknapp on a short term, didn't he, to get him out of trouble on the advice of a board member who's a friend of Harry's. And what's that? It was Kemsley.
It was Kemsley, wasn't it? Paul Kemsley.
That's what I thought. It was Kemsley. And and look, I think it provided a real problem for Levy. The Redknapp's success, in a sense, provided Levy with a problem because you're absolutely right. Not the fit, personality-wise. So, yeah, I mean, we'll go a little more general now because obviously we are, because we're huge supporters and geeks, in danger of getting sucked into manager by manager. I very nearly went down the sinkhole of giving you AVB's PowerPoint presentation there to get the job. But let's look in general at the impact of selling star players in that early noughties period. I mean, we had Luka Modric left in the summer of 2012. Gareth Bale left in the summer of 2013. Was it a case of selling Elvis and buying the Beatles? We had Bale to Madrid. We had Ericsson came in, Lamela, Chadley, Paulinho, Soldado, Capoue, Chicheris. They all signed. What did you think of these deals? Was it more a case of selling Elvis and buying Arcade Fire if Brian Eno had been an incongruous member in the end of it all? Did it kind of reflect more like that?
So I think Spurs have always been labelled in this sort of modern iteration as a selling club, and I think that that definitely happened in the 90s. So you think when we sold Sheringham, when Klinsmann left to an extent, Berbatov, Carrick, there weren't many other good players around them. I think the difference when we started selling Modric, and then Bale, is that there was a much better supporting cast with them at the time. I just think culturally, perhaps it's a Spurs thing, perhaps it's more an English football thing, there's this huge issue with selling your best players, and that's seen as a sign of weakness. Whereas actually, I think what Levy's done very, very well and always has done is knowing where, or perhaps we'll go on to find he steers away from this, is actually knowing when to sell players. And it's when you get a valuation of a player which is perhaps above what you believe it to be, is the best time to sell them. But I think as a nation, and certainly as a group of supporters, we're not very good at accepting that.
Yeah, I mean, selling our best player hasn't really happened since Bale, has it? That was the last one. And we'll go on to talk about the new stadium, but I think that was really key, wasn't it, in trying to sort ourselves out financially. During this period, we weren't a regular top four club. We didn't have that kind of financial stability, and it was very, very difficult for us to hold off these advances. I mean, obviously, we got another season out of Modric, and he performed during that season. He was excellent during that season.
Fantastic.
And obviously, it's a darn sight better that we sold him to Real Madrid than Chelsea. And to be fair, there weren't many clubs around the world that could hold off an advance, a bid from Chelsea at that time. Steff, you were about to talk about AVB. I think when we talk about Modric being sold and Bale being sold, we have to talk about AVB and the impact that had on him, and what he was left with.
Well, we should also remind people that Modric went the year he came in, and Bale went after the year that he calibrated the whole side to get within a point of Champions League football. And
let's face it, I mean, Bale did that single-handedly, didn't he? Pretty much that season.
Yeah.
So I think, it had a huge impact on us that during that period. We lost two of the best players in world football that decade in successive seasons to arguably the biggest club in the world for massive fees. And but yeah, it had, and I think Gareth's right. I think like psychologically on us, it did have an impact. And even now, people will talk about us being a selling club, despite the fact that we haven't really sold anyone we didn't want to sell for a long, long time.
And it's very interesting. Sorry, did I cut you?
No, it's all right. I was just going to go on and sing the praises of Eric Lamela for an hour, so you're probably best to cut in now.
Yeah, I mean, I'll cut in and then we can go back to that because we should always spare a minute for Eric. I think, going back to your point about AVB being sort of much more of a Levy type, I think what we're seeing here at this point of the tens is Levy really deciding, Redknapp helping Levy decide, I want this structure. I want a director of football. I want a technical coach. I want a team. So Baldini comes in and does all this trading, and he decides that, okay, I can sell Bale because Baldini will take care of things and he will get things, right. And so it's the beginning of Daniel reasserting what he tried with Martin Jol and Frank Arneson and got his heart broken over.
And arguably the closest he's got to getting it right since is now. Because all of this period he tries it and it's just not quite right. The matchup between director of football and manager, or the appointment of the managers isn't quite right. And
well, we're definitely going to get into that with Poch because there's I
suppose you could argue that Mitchell and Poch maybe, but
that was a brilliant partnership, which I think was, unfortunately, Daniel wasn't quite ready to go with it. And he would go one more revolution, by the way, in switching away from that model. He did go one more revolution.
I think maybe the thing with Mitchell is that, he came to us from Southampton. If he come, he's done very well as a director of football elsewhere since. If he was coming to the club now, maybe he'd carry a bit more weight. And I think what Paratici's got, and same as Conte's got, is he's got a load of clout. And, you can turn around and say, look, I've done this at Juve. Fuck off, Daniel. You don't have this experience.
Yeah, and look, it's, again, we're trying not to get too forensic about it. We should go back very briefly to these players that came in and just let's quickly recap on them. I think that there is one standout band member, one cult hero, and the rest were a bridge to the other side of this tens period in Tottenham Hotspur history.
Eriksson was clearly a success. Is a really, really good player. I think I'd argue that the rest weren't bad. Maybe with the exception of Kerekes, but he's had a reasonable career since leaving us. Yeah, Lamela, he'd never been injured before signing for us and had been ripping out for Roma. I think he was logically, it's a really. I just heard your zip go then, Steff. That was quite off-putting. Is that a normal reaction to be talking about Eric Lamela?
Shh, I thought we weren't going to mention that on this pod.
I think on paper, at least, the Lamela signing made a lot of sense. Nasser Chadli, I think, was a decent player and certainly a good squad player. Paulinho made a lot of sense. It didn't work out.
You didn't hear my zipper going when you were talking about Chadli, did you? No, okay.
Capoue again had a decent career. When he went, had a good spell at Watford, didn't he? It was all right. Soldado, again, I think on paper at least these are sensible signings. It just sometimes doesn't work, and maybe it was just too much change in one go, and it took them a little while to settle in. But
I think that's absolutely the case. Paulinho for me he's probably one of the biggest sort of misses/misfortunes of the noughties. A technically brilliant player who I think could have done tremendous work for us. And there was a moment. Did he not get suspended after the Liverpool game? Was it a suspension or injury? There was a switch point with him, and he never recovered from it because he was starting to really find some form for us.
I was really excited about him.
Yeah.
Before he signed, his performances for Brazil have been fantastic.
We all thought we had a version of Lampard, I think.
Yeah.
At the time, that's how he was built. And I'd always go back to the theory that about 50% of transfers are successful, and very, very few managers, even the best ones, will struggle to get many more than 50% of them right. So if you think from those 7, Eriksson's definitely a success. Lamela and Chadli definitely were better than what we had at the time. And you think Chadli was that bridge then into Son and Dele Alli breaking into the team a couple of years later.
Yeah, I agree with that. And look, we'll move on. AVB missed Champions League by a point, and the toys went flying from the pram. He's definitely, I think, a somewhat unique individual. It's probably safest to say.
I think probably the other thing we need to say about AVB is that he, from that kind of famous PowerPoint interview, I think he promised something that he didn't actually deliver. So I think he said one thing and then actually wanted something else. He was meant to have really signed into the kind of academy and bringing through young players approach. And then, as you said, Steff, he threw his toys out of the pram. What he wanted was us to spend a load of money. And I think there was that disconnect between what he'd said to get the job and then what he actually wanted when he got the job. And then I think it was very, very sad, that kind of end period, because he really kind of shrunk into himself, didn't he? I think
he's never really recovered, has he?
I think he's done okay in League One since, and had some decent, done reasonably well since. But you really saw him shrink into his shell, and the criticism got too much for him. And,
you're talking about the final months at the club, final couple of months.
The We Is Us one was the big one, wasn't it? And we got some pretty heavy shoeings. 6 up at Man City. The Liverpool one was the final straw. We got beat 3-0 at home by West Ham.
I mean, I was quite worried for kind of the impact it was having on him during that period, because
he was cracking.
He was.
It
just wasn't nice. It just wasn't nice.
No, and I mean, he also got caught in the Gareth Bale trap, which is you've got a player who was absolutely about to hit his peak. He was probably just 1,000 foot off summiting Everest in terms of peak performance. He was, and it's sort of like having a Messi in your side. You like everything inevitably goes through him, and you end up building a side to serve him because he can get you to where you need to go, and it didn't quite happen. So he got caught in that trap a little bit, and understandably so. But well noted, Milo. It was really actually quite sad to watch his, and he displayed some clear signs of mental fatigue. It was really hard to watch. We ended up with Tim Sherwood. Gareth, I'm going to hand this to you, just very briefly.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm going to say about Tim Sherwood is that he has done some very good work behind the scenes in making sure that lots of our good young players were getting some really good loan moves. And I think we can see now just how difficult it is to get that right. So the likes of Ryan Mason, Andros Townsend, and most famously Harry Kane all went out and got really good Football League spells whilst they were Spurs players. And that definitely put them in really good stead to then come back into the first team when he was the manager, not Mason, but certainly Kane and Townsend. He was the ones that he started to embed into the first team.
Bentaleb as well.
Bentaleb's the name I'm looking for there. Yeah, thank you. So I think we have to ignore all the comical press conferences that he gave and all the tactics, Tim, and stuff that goes on with that. I mean, really, I guess he took over a team that was in 6th place, and we finished the season in 6th place. But I think, the work that he did outside of that role should be something that should leave him with a good legacy at the club.
I think he's a prat, and I'm kind of glad that this period happened, because it meant that he got out of the club, and I don't think we would have been able to move on with him around. I think there's periods in this decade where we'll see people who are in Levy's ear. And I think he was one of those who was in Levy's ear saying, I could do that job, and probably had more, maybe had more influence than he warranted. And I think we're better off without him in the club. I think certainly as a modern football club, I don't think Tim Sherwood really has any place in a modern football club. I don't think he understands the modern game particularly. We talk about Redknapp and that kind of up and atom kind of attitude. I think Sherwood's cut from the same cloth, and I'm sure he's fine as a person, but I don't want him in my football club, and I don't think I think it was good to get him out. I don't think Poch happens with Sherwood around.
Before we move on to the next stage of the tens, we should dwell for a moment on the fact that this football club very nearly took us into crimes against football territory for me. And in 2011, unveiled plans to demolish the Olympic Stadium and move to Stratford. And build a new one. The idea being that Crystal Palace would be refurbished to host athletics, and we were going to be building a new stadium at the Stratford Retail Park. Chaps, how do you remember feeling at that time? I mean, it was clear we needed to do something because, as we've all been agreeing it was incongruous that we were going to become a Champions League regular without some significant income. But, this did seem like a pretty heavy price to pay, did it not?
I don't think we'll ever know how much that was a power play against Haringey Council at the time, who it appeared were dragging their feet a little bit with any potential plans that we had to develop the site, as ultimately happened. So whether that was pure pragmatic opportunism on the club's part, just to try and just drop that in there and give Haringey something to think about or not, I don't know whether we'll ever know, or not at least until Daniel Levy writes his memoirs maybe in 20 years' time. But it certainly felt very real at the time, and it really triggered some very visceral reaction in a lot of people. I mean, you'd have to say, looking back at it in hindsight, you'd say it was probably a good power play to put on the table, because ultimately it worked. I think everyone got what they wanted and what they should have done. West Ham should always have had that stadium in Stratford, and we always should have been building our one on site where we were, which is what happened.
I mean, I think, putting aside how I felt about it for one moment, I think Levy was certainly true. It was certainly been proved right about how, what should have happened with that stadium, knocking it down, building a new stadium, a football stadium, and redeveloping Crystal Palace is a far, far better outcome than what's actually happened with the place, because it's a bloody awful football stadium and it doesn't really work as an athletic stadium anymore. So it would have been better for football and better for athletics if what he wanted to do was done, whether, ideally just not by us. I hated the idea of moving to Stratford. It would have been awful, and I think it really would have made me question about, my support of the club, I suppose. It's, although it's only, a few miles down the road, it would have felt really, really wrong.
Yeah, it was a few miles too many, wasn't it? I mean, I'm right with you. I mean, I remember the news. I mean, it hit me with actually a wave of revulsion. I mean, I was actually revolted by the idea. It appalled me. Yeah, I agree. I couldn't agree more. I will ask this as we approach the next manager, who will be taking us pretty much through to the end of the episode, bar one unfortunate brief interruption. And I want to approach Mauricio Pochettino's appointment from a slightly different angle. We've been talking about Levy and his plans with the stadium, and he's desperately looking to grow this club. He's desperately looking to get this new stadium built. He's looking for any way to get funding. Like, how can I do this? What councils? He makes the decision to appoint Southampton's manager. Do we think that this is genius on his part? Bravery? I mean, it's an incredibly brave thing to do when you're looking to appeal to investors and say, I want to build this new stadium for this massive club with this huge history, but we haven't actually done very much, in the last 20, 25 years. And by the way, the manager I'm bringing in is the manager of Southampton. I mean, he didn't go for a marquee name. He went back to his model of, I'm going to try and find someone who can, work with a director of football and bring through the youth. A brave decision by Levy, or did he really know what he was doing when Mauricio Pochettino was appointed?
I don't think, in terms of kind of stadium finance, who the manager is makes that much difference. They would look at the kind of broader picture, I think, and our league results or league finishes have been pretty decent, and Premier League money alone would be enough to finance it, and I'm pretty sure that's the basis it was done on. I mean, Poch had done very well at Southampton. They've been a good side to watch. You've got to bear in mind, actually, that it was kind of changes in the boardroom at Southampton that led to him leaving there. He'd been very, very happy there. He had a very close relationship with the board there. And
Nicola Cortese.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
And then when he was removed, he'd been pretty vocal about wanting to leave. So I think, that opened that opportunity. I'm not sure he would have come otherwise.
No, so there's another sliding doors moment as well, because you remember that we were very close to appointing Louis van Gaal at that point.
Oh, yes.
And
well remembered.
From memory, it was him turning us down because Man United job had become available, and they were clearly interested in him.
You've answered the question for me, because I'd forgotten that, and you're absolutely right. I'd forgotten that actually he turned us down for Man United. And by the way, can I just share a very personal and weird thing? That man has always had, and God bless him, I don't know him. He may be the nicest man in the world, and, much respect for his battles to full health again from his illness. But that being said, he's got the most punchable faces I've ever seen. And untrustworthy. I remember another feeling. I just didn't like him.
Is it Beavis or Butthead he looks like? I can't remember which one it is.
He looks like Beavis
Butthead.
to me.
No,
Beavis, the blonde one. He looks like the blonde one, I think. No? Oh, actually, look, he's probably could look like either, but Beavis to me. Beavis is the one with the smaller nose.
Look it up and tweet us.
Yeah, Beavis is the smaller nose.
Look more like Beavis or Butthead.
Yeah, but anyway, but I just remember, you're so right, and what an important sliding doors moment that is to remind. I bet many people have forgotten that, Gareth, because that was Van Gaal nearly became our manager, and I was not into it. I didn't know much about Poch, but I wasn't into it.
He would have been a disaster for us as well. I think
awful.
I mean, synergy must be one of the kind of most overused phrases we use on this pod. But Poch's appointment really was a kind of synergy, wasn't it? It was just the right person at the right place at the right time. Everything came together, and with that group of young players at the same time, it was just perfect. And we've got the question noted down here about kind of him clearing out the older players, some of the players that had been around a while, and it was so key, because if you think back to that season, his first season there, he persevered with some of the senior players, didn't he? So Adebayor, BAE, Kabul started the season as captain, and we got results weren't great to start with, and then
it wasn't a great season. We lost at home to West Brom, we lost at home to Stoke.
Well, and he's just recently written in The Athletic for a column he's doing about the World Cup. He's recently reignited the memories of that last-minute victory at Aston Villa with Harry Kane's deflected free kick, which he has re-articulated as being, to use a phrase that we have been using a lot on this pod, that was his sliding doors moment, because according to him, and he'd said it at the time and he repeated it, that kick doesn't go in, he might have been on his way. I mean, I always thought that was a little bit hyperbolic, but no, it appears that it was really the case. So,
well, yeah, and I always remember that was the week after that we lost at home to Stoke. So it wasn't as if that was the turning point, and then everything turned to gold after that. We still had a terrible home defeat. The players were booed off the week after at home to Stoke.
Wasn't there meant to be a dressing room confrontation between the younger players and
there was.
that older player? So
I think at that Stoke game, actually.
I think it was Kane, Mason.
Yes. You're absolutely right. Bentaleb was in there as well.
Townsend.
Yeah, Townsend confronted them and about their lack of appetite, their lack of desire.
Yes.
And then they were ostracised. Do you remember the game where, was it Benny and Adebayor were in a box and were sending photos whilst the game was going on, taking the piss?
Yeah.
But basically, I mean, Adebayor ended up training with the kids, didn't he? He was completely ostracised. I think was Benny as well. I think Benny did as well, didn't he?
Yeah.
Kabul for sure as well. I mean, there was a core, and there's a big discussion about captaincy, right? Because Kabul was captain, and I think that Poch made the decision to let the dressing room work itself out and see who won, so to speak. I remember that being the narrative at the time, and it was very much, I think he felt the only way that the youth could come through and truly claim it. Like he couldn't be seen to phase them in, and he wanted it to sort out. He was sort of social theatre in a way, I suppose. But I remember wondering if it was going to work out. I do remember that, but I remember thinking it was very necessary because I was unimpressed with those players at that time.
You effectively see this kind of clash between Redknapp's Spurs and Poch's Spurs.
Yeah, no, very well observed. Yeah.
Because a lot of these players are players that either Redknapp brought in, or in Kabul's case brought back to the club because he'd had a spell before and then gone off to Portsmouth and then came back. What an important decision, because you think of you look at those players and what's happened since. Although you've seen some players leave, and there'll be what ifs. So Bentaleb was such a what if, because he was so instrumental early on. And then, just didn't quite work out. But
there are a couple of fascinating team issues early doors, I think, with Poch that really told you who he was. You've picked up on Bentaleb, and we've regular listeners will know we've featured Bentaleb as a player in the past, and he's a player of some intrigue to all of us, I think, because we all felt that he was a future captain. But he crossed the line. He crossed the line with a member of Poch's staff, and Poch wasn't going to have it. And it's interesting that the decisions he was making early on in terms of discipline, and also in terms of just pure upgrades. I mean, you know, Chadley for me is very interesting because Chadley is a decent player, and we talked about this off pod, Milo. I know he's a good squad player, but ultimately Poch determined that he was Europa League and he was not going to be Champions League, and so onwards. And these are the little key decisions he was making. He's much tougher than he seemed, wasn't he?
Ryan Mason as well. I mean, he was clearly a player that Poch loved. But wasn't going to be able to give him the minutes he needed. Andros Townsend, same.
Yes, very true. And Andros, again, was another player who he liked, but he crossed the line with a member of the staff. And you think about it, you know, Poch obviously comes to us with we look back on him, and the first, you know, emotions I think most of us have are of the warmth and the family vibe and all of that. But behind it was a pretty hard guy. I mean, he was not going to take any shit. He had a way. And it was his way. But he had a very good way of not making that necessarily public. And he also, by the way, remember when he really disguised himself for some time by, I think his English was always better than than he led on. And he bought himself some valuable time early on, didn't he, by not having to get sucked into press bullshit.
I think at Southampton it was a tactic to deflect attention, not have to answer questions, and obviously when he got our job, that wasn't an option because of the pressure that would have brought. But no, I think you're absolutely right.
So the other thing about that period is the emergence of Kane onto the scene, but secondly, how he eventually found a way to incorporate Moussa Dembele into the team, who would go on to become such an important player for us. But it wasn't inevitable that was going to happen. I think for 2 years we'd had Dembele as this Modric replacement, and no one ever really knew how to get the best out of him. And certainly Poch struggled with that to the extent that Dembele had a bit of a renaissance right at the start of 2015, but then had an absolute stinker against West Ham, which was the week before the League Cup final against Chelsea. And effectively, he played himself out of the team. So he only came on as a sub. But it's only really the next season that the team really starts to get built around him.
But I think the other thing you've got to bear in mind with Dembele is that, you know, he was predominantly a wide forward for, you know, up until this period.
Yeah,
it seems so obvious to play him at the base of midfield because he's so strong and difficult to knock off the ball and great at carrying it. But that isn't really where he'd played. You know, he'd been, you know, a forward of, you know, played across the front line, mainly in the Premier League before we got him.
Paul Mitchell, who was obviously the sporting director of football at Southampton, arrived with Poch as part of his team. You know, he I don't know if he was directly the person who brought Sonny in, but Sonny comes in with him. And then we've talked about this many times. There were two players that he identified that he really wanted, Wijnaldum and Mane, and for whatever reasons, we can debate those and have debated them and will doubtless do so again. They didn't arrive. Paul Mitchell goes. How significant is that, do you think, in the tens for us? How significant was that summer?
I don't know. I mean, I think Poch has suggested that they weren't quite on the same wavelength by that period, so I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure how significant it was. I think Poch certainly wanted to become a manager, didn't he, rather than a coach? And so he wanted more control over signings, which I think probably in hindsight was a mistake because I think Poch was a bit indecisive on signing players and was in search of perfection that wasn't available. And I think he probably needs someone to do that for him, but I'm not sure he recognised it in himself. And certainly it was interesting kind of towards the end after the Champions League final. Poch started talking to him about himself as being a coach again, didn't he? Whereas he'd been very proud when he got the title as of manager. So I'm not sure is the answer to that. I think Poch was probably on a slightly different trajectory at that point and wanted to be, you know, more of a traditional English manager and maybe didn't want those influences around.
Yeah, well, if I was going to have one criticism of Poch, it would be that he tended to surround himself with people who he trusted very much, but maybe who didn't challenge him. So you think the Jesus Perez, Vicky Agostino, and I forget the name of the other fella. But when you read the book Jimenez, when you read the book that he and Guillaume Balaguer put together a couple of years later, you certainly get the sense there that they're all reading off the same hymn sheet, which I'm sure comes with many positives.
Yeah, if I'm going to criticise him, it would be that book. That was a fucking stupid idea.
No, No, it was really, I was so conflicted by it because, you know, I was in full acolyte mode at that point. I worshipped the ground that he walked on, and then he suddenly dropped that book, and I'm like, oh, well, I hope it's going to be a fluffy little look into how he thinks about the game. And all of a sudden I'm reading about Eric Dyer's potential move to Man United that he managed to snuff out and things like that. Yeah. And I'm like, this does not need to happen. This cannot be good for the dressing room. Couldn't agree more. A massive own goal by Poch on that one. And no one's ever asked him why he did it, why he wrote that book. I mean, and if he regrets it, I think it's a question I'd love someone to ask him, because it was certainly a big issue, I think.
I think he said he was doing a favour for him, didn't he? Because they were friends from his time in Spain, and I think it was doing a mate a favour.
Well, but I certainly hope, if that's the case, that was when Maurizio learnt that, you know, friends who ask favours like that at that time of your life are not friends; they're opportunist scum. But no, you know, that's no good. I'm sorry, that's ridiculous. But I mean, I agree with you. But
the time to do that is after you've left, basically, because it's certainly. I think he betrayed a dressing room trust then, and it was
100%. 100%. Look, if you're in a band and you know, a rock band, or if you work in rock and roll or whatever, the only time you should do a book, if you do one at all, is when it's either winding down or it's all over, because you can't write a decent book or tell a decent story unless you're getting out of there, or as you said, you start betraying confidence.
It's very similar, isn't it? You've got a dressing room there. You've got, you know, the studio space is very similar to the training ground or what have you. You can't betray the trust there. And also, there's frequent fallings out. It happens. It's a high pressure environment where you're going to piss each other off. And if those relationships are going to heal, you need to be able to do that in private.
Yeah.
Well, just one question briefly. So we talked about director of football. And obviously, the player we haven't talked about is Dele. Is Dele the last David Pleat signing that the club's had? I think Pleaty, I think he's gone on record saying he recommended him.
Well, he would be. Carl Walker and Carl Norton came in under his
that's a lot earlier, though, isn't
jurisdiction.
it?
That's a lot earlier. So yeah, no, I think you may well be right. Yeah,
Walker's 2010, so he's 5 years before Dele.
I'm trying to think which other players we've signed, but essentially you're looking for the profile of player who was playing in the lower divisions, very young, probably pre-20. Who's come in. I mean, we've had a few, just looking at other players we signed at that decade, which clearly had nothing to do with David Pleat, but you got Ng, Nkudu, Stambouli, Dyer, obviously all came in around that era.
But, yeah, I mean, before we get on to that, if you don't mind, because Milo's opened up the Dele question, I think that he is such a talismanic figure of the tens, and you know, alongside Harry Kane, even more so than Christian Eriksen, is probably symbolic of it.
So I think the thing with Dele is that it's a bit like we just said with Poch in terms of kind of right place, right time. You know, I'm not sure that if Dele had joined the club at any other point in our history, he would have had the impact and been as successful as he was. I think it was just that synergy. You know, although he was playing for NK Dons at a very young age. I think he captained them at 18, hadn't he? And he was predominantly playing as a central midfielder for them. Poch playing him further forwards, and it just all clicking. I just don't think it. And obviously later on, Poch wasn't bringing through young players in the same way that he was early on. If it had happened any other way, I just don't think it ends up like it does. And it was just one of those kind of beautiful moments. Everything at that point just came together, and you've got a group of players that just, you know, grabbed it and ran with it. And we all went on a journey, you know, manager, players, fans, all of us. And the culmination of that was that Champions League final. And it was just a great trip. And we can't recreate that. There'll be another trip at some point, but we can't recreate that as much as we'd like to. We can't hold on to it. We've got to move on. But it was just beautiful.
Thanks, lads. That was a lot of fun. I mean, I can't add anything to that. I mean, if I did, I'd be here for half an hour. I get quite emotional hearing you wrap up that particular tangent that we went off on, especially with regards to Dele and the synergy, that word again, between him and Poch. I mean, it is very emotional. I mean, it was such a great ride. I mean, you talk about the Beatles. That was the Beatles right there. It was beautiful.
Ricky talks quite a lot, doesn't he, about the synergy between the kind of the owners and the manager and the players and the fans. And I think that's what was happening there. It's just everyone was in the same place, in the same, you know, on the same, at the same time.
So that, you know, to hone in on that point, obviously, the Leicester season, so on and so forth, everyone, we should have won the league, everyone, whatever about that. I'm not going to dive down that. What I do want to ask you both is, we talk about vital games in the tens. When we look at the game at Stamford Bridge, the Battle of the Bridge, how important was that in setting the table for the next 3 years that we enjoyed under Poch? I mean, for me, it was one of the most important games of Poch's tenure because it established something that I hadn't seen from us in decades, which was a team that was prepared to fight for each other as well as other players.
I mean, I think regardless of what happened at that game, Leicester was still going to win the title that season.
I agree.
I know that's not the question that you're asking. I think that the cast had already been been set. But I mean, this was very much the school bully, riling up the other kid in class for years, and unfortunately the teacher turning around when the other kid turns around and lamps the bully, wasn't it? That's how it felt. Although we were very much the aggressor in that game, that felt like that was years worth of frustration that had been pent up. And as you were saying there, it felt like everything was channeled together. Those players don't remember when Frank Arneson left us to join Chelsea and all the other nonsense that we've had to put up with since Abramovich had taken over. But it all seemed to come out in that moment, and it was that universal energy that that carried through. But I still think it would have been the more clever thing to have done would have been to have seen out that game and actually to have won there. Whether it would have ended up as winning the title or not, I think that would have been a bigger statement had we gone there and finished off and beaten them 2-0.
The other game that I think is super important, and it's the same season, was we still had the chance to finish second to Leicester. And on the final day of the season, we went up to play a game, I believe it was at Newcastle, if I remember correctly. And most of the players were on the pitch, I guess, but didn't show up. And we lost 5-1 and we gave up that second place to Arsenal, who pipped us. It's the last time they finished above us, I believe, in the Premiership to this day. How important was that in finalising some of the things that Poch was going to go on and do for the next 2-3 years?
I still maintain that the difference between finishing second and third is probably the least significant certainly in the top half of the Premier League. And I think if that had been any other club other than Arsenal that had finished above us that day, we probably all would have laughed most of the way back home from Newcastle of that just being the end of a really dramatic and climatic season. So yeah, If that had been Liverpool or Man City that had finished above us in second place, I don't think anyone would have remembered it beyond then. It's really, I mean, you saying that has just brought back the memories to me. It's a really, really painful memory, but I think only because of the team that leapfrogged us to go into third place that day. Look at the season that we had the following year. Psychologically, that didn't seem to have that much of an impact on us, apart from Poch's waistline, because he said he just binged on pizzas and burgers, didn't he, for about 6 weeks after that?
I think you're right. I think in terms, difference between second and third is nothing. I think, other than Arsenal, I think, it was a good quip. The coming third in the 2-horse race is a good line and it's memorable and people bought into it, didn't it? It kind of fits, again, it fits a narrative.
So I have a different view of it. I think it showed Poch that as much as there were good players in our squad, there were some that were just not going to be good enough and were not going to get us to where he wanted. And I think that was, if I remember correctly, was that not the season that Chadley ended up moving on, and there are a few others. I think it was hurt him deeply. We went through that final season at the Lane unbeaten and playing possibly some of our best football ever as a football club. It's fair to say. Any specific thoughts on this run under Poch, and let's also bring that across to then having to go into Wembley for the next season and play, and that being our home stadium, as Daniel finally gets the dream project off the ground. Let's combine both.
Yeah, well, of course, we were desperately unlucky in that final season at White Hart Lane that Chelsea, with Antonio Conte, of all people, had a European free season because they'd done so badly the year before. They had free midweeks. And as we know now from Antonio Conte, if you give him one game a week with a pretty good squad anyway, he's going to do well with that one. So to finish on 86 points and still be 7 points off the title was almost heartbreaking. But such a good season. I mean, I'll always remember it just for beating Arsenal, which secured the first time we'd finished above them. And it felt like a real passing of the baton moment from them back to us finally, that we just so comprehensively outplayed them to beat them 2-0.
It's probably my favourite season, I think, actually. It was just, again, just vibes. It was just really, really good vibes, and just we were good. We were good. You know, you went to games confident that we'd win, and we'd play good football, and you know, I think kind of all the stuff we've already touched on. You know, everyone was pulling in the same direction. Everyone bought into it. You know, that connection between the fans and the team, I'm not sure has ever been the same since.
No, I think that the fact that we were still at the lane, and just the lane was such a fortress, and it just did feel that we were all in this together on this brilliant, like, holistic journey. And then Poch was throwing his auras and lemons out there, and it was beautiful. And I was petting spaniels and drinking whiskey, and you know, it was, and we're beating Chelsea and coming back against West Ham. My God, that West Ham comeback was absolutely fucking brilliant. By the way, I was sat right by the West Ham fans. I enjoyed that day so much.
but also everyone knew that there was a bulldozer going through their dreams, their memories very soon. You know, they knew that the stadium was going to get levelled, and there was everything that went with that. And you think that last game of that season where Poch is walking out on the pitch and he's crying.
Yeah, I will never. That is one of the most significant events of my life, was being at that game, final game against Man United. It was just, it was huge, and it was a huge season. And then, you know, he's got to deal with going to a new stadium off the back of that, and not just a new stadium, the National Stadium, different sightlines, different pitch, different everything. Right, that's a lot to deal with.
I mean, I remember we were really, really good that season. I think people often overlook how good we were that year. We got 77 points that season. We'd never really in the title race, because that was the first sort of Pep title winning season at Man City. They were just streets ahead of us. But that was the Champions League campaign when we beat Real Madrid at Wembley 3-1, which has to go down as one of the best Spurs performances of a generation, let alone of the decade. To take them apart 3-1 that night. We also got past Dortmund, and then really we were outdone by a very, very canny Juventus side in the round of 16. But I think if you're sort of aggregating how good we were in the league and in Europe that year, that was maybe our best season of the decade, because the 86-point season at White Hart Lane, we stunk the place out in the Champions League, albeit that we played those games at Wembley. That was the Leverkusen-Monaco season. So I've got great affection for that 17-18 season. I think we were ever so good that year.
I mean, I remember just being incredulous and joyous at the same time as we went 3-0 up against Liverpool within like 20 minutes. Yeah. Are you just thinking, how much better can this get? I mean, it was incredible. We took them apart. Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt that you know, and then we get into, you know, stickier times in a way, right? I mean, this is when it starts to get a little odd. Yeah.
Yeah. So my criticism of it is mainly around the stadium and just everything about, I just don't like Wembley. But I think, you know, what we're saying about is right about the Poch era before, about that connection. It starts to, it's not quite there, because it doesn't feel the same in Wembley as it did at White Hart Lane, or, you know, our new ground, the new White Hart Lane. And it was just a bit more of a distance, a bit more of a gap, and just not quite there.
Do we think that the fact that, you know, Daniel was so obviously wrapped up in the stadium project, and there was so much energy going into that, forget the finance, but so much energy going into it, that maybe the closeness that he and Poch had shared was a little less, because there just wasn't the time in the day, and that just there was just too many things going on at once, and Poch left increasingly managing several situations that you know were very, very tough. I mean, do you think that's a significant issue there?
What I would say is that this is the period when we definitely needed a director of football.
Right. That's what
Levy was entirely focused on the stadium, quite rightly.
Yes.
And, you know, you look at what the result is, then, you know, it's fantastic. You know, it was attention well spent, and it had to be his priority, but we needed someone who could look after the football side of things, which he clearly wasn't being able to focus on. And, you know, obviously finances were tough during that period, because stadiums ain't cheap. But, you know, that, you know, we all hark back to that summer where we didn't sign anyone. And I think if we'd had someone in who could have focused on transfer activity, that wouldn't have happened. I think also there was an issue with not moving players on. I think the squad got a little bit stale.
Massive.
So I think it's lack of player, you know, that players leaving as much as, you know, not new player, you know, new players not coming in.
Yeah, but we were then running off fumes for much of the next season, and I know we'll talk about the Champions League run, but it really did feel that this was the last throw of that team, which I think at some point mentally and physically they probably tapped out.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's a very, very good point with regards to moving players out as well. I mean, this is when I think we really started to see the breakdowns of communication, as we've ascertained and agreed, with no real fault when you look at it holistically. Everyone is fully committed to doing what they're doing. Levy, by all accounts, was so involved in everything to do with the stadium that, I've spoken to a couple of people who were, working quite heavily in that project, and they said, he was 24 hours a day and he drove us to the our fingers to the bone. But you respected it because he was in there with you. He was doing it with you. He was obsessed, and the obsession was contagious. And Poch is trying to say to him at the same time, look, I need to move things on. I've got a player who's not going to sign a contract in 18 months, who's massive. Maybe we should move him on. Maybe we should reinvest. And it wasn't happening. And so there's a breakdown there.
And there were quite a few players. We knew he wanted shot of Alderweireld. We know he wanted shot of Danny Rose. We know he wanted shot of Ericsson. He wanted out, didn't he?
He had made the conclusion. He'd come to the conclusion, hadn't he, that because he couldn't talk Christian Eriksen into signing a new contract, that it was, rather than postpone the heartbreak, it was best to get it done then, so as hopefully things could be in place, when the stadium finally happened. Yeah. And of course, then to cap it all off, guys, there was that ludicrously tight time projection with regards to the, moving into the stadium, and it got shoved by half a year.
Yeah.
So Poch suddenly ends up like more than that, right? You're right.
Yeah. So it was April it opened, so
nearly another full season.
Yeah. Yeah, 2 months short of that, yeah.
And Gareth, I know that you were hinted at that was the season that we were going to talk about, and let's talk about it, because that was the same season, was it not? It was 2018, 2019. We've not signed anyone. There's a little bit of an impasse communication-wise. Everyone's trying to get the wiring right at the new stadium. The players are absolutely burnt out, yet somehow we end up in the biggest game, arguably, of the club's career.
Yeah, well, as you know, I like referencing things back to the 90s, but for me, it was so similar to the FA Cup winning year in 1991, where we actually started the league season so well, and by November, we looked like, mathematically we had a good chance of challenging for the league, but the league form just fell off a cliff. But we seemed to be able to turn it on for those cup games. So in the same way that we did in 1991, where we ended up beating Arsenal in the semi-final and missed a pretty awful league run, that's exactly what happened in 2019. So we were putting all of our energy, whether that was subliminal or deliberate or not, I don't know. But you look at those performances to beat Dortmund 3-0, then to go out there and win 1-0, the incredible effort that went into that Manchester City home leg. I mean, I said the second leg was perhaps just a combination of, we talk about flip of the coin moments. There were several of them up at the Etihad, but actually the hard work was done at home because we won 1-0, didn't concede an away goal, and that provided us a platform to go up there and then Amsterdam.
Getting that point at Barcelona.
Yeah.
I mean, squeezing that point out. Another Lucas Moura effort, it should be pointed out.
Yeah, and you think we came back from 1-0 down against PSV to win 2-1 in the game that preceded that one. So there were all these seat of your pants moments in that Champions League game that if you're putting it together in a script, you'd never get it passed off. It would seem so fictitious and far-fetched that it just couldn't happen. And of course, from a personal level, knowing that the Champions League final day was going to fall on my wedding day as well.
Wow.
Another interesting element of that season was that we brought in Llorente. We brought in a veteran winner. And one of my rare criticisms of Poch in his era was that I don't think he utilised the potential of an experienced player in the dressing room, getting one in. I remember Dani Alves being on the block a season or two before, and I remember hoping he would get him in because I thought his experience might be good for the squad. But he did this time with Llorente, and Llorente turned out to be an incredibly important player in that Champions League run, didn't he? I mean, he was just vital to everything that we did in those final games to get to the final. And, people talk about, it really was a crescendo, wasn't it? Building, but it was sort of a crescendo of chaos. We go into the new stadium in April, half of our team are knackered. We've got key injuries. we're sort of like, we barely fighting to stay in the top four. I still can't believe we finished top four that season. I mean, it really was the most extraordinary season, wasn't it? I mean, and it's we look at it with sadness now, but you could also say it was a tremendous success in its own way to even get to where we got. Am I being too romantic there or not?
I think you're right. I think what you have to recognise is it came at a huge emotional cost. I think it wrung every last drop out of Pochettino and quite a few of those players as well. And what we had the following season was just the most almighty hangover.
I'm gesturing for you to speak because I'm trying to stop myself from following up because I'm quite passionate about everything to do with this era, and let alone what Milo's just said, which I think is absolutely on point. I mean, and I was so emotionally wrapped up in it as well that I, as a supporter, failed to see what should have happened after that Champions League final. I failed to see it. I couldn't recognise it.
And I think if we're honest, the reason why, this podcast is very guilty of this, is that we quite often talk about Pochettino as much as we do as the current manager, is because that emotional involvement, that emotional investment, we talked already about that kind of synergy during that period, and everyone was pulling in the same direction, and it took it out of all of us. And we've still got that, we've still got that feeling that's left over. And I think the players still have that. I think Pochettino still has that. He still talks very fondly about that. We're talking amongst ourselves. We're talking the other week about him hanging out with Ozzy and Ricky and others. And it's clear that it's still there. But I think that's why we still talk about it.
He turned around and said in this Athletic column recently, he was talking about Kane, and he said, by the way, he basically said, by the way, when I was at PSG, I didn't even make a move to sign Harry Kane because I love Tottenham too much and I wouldn't do it to them. And I just looked, and again, I just felt, I didn't bother reading the rest of it. There might have been more context to it, that I'd seen enough. The love was still real. It was. I've trained myself not to be keyed off by that stuff as much as I used to be, but it still twinged my heartstrings, I have to tell you.
The truth of the matter is, the reason he didn't try to sign Harry Kane at PSV is because he had absolutely nothing to do with transfers there, and they wouldn't. It was just Leonardo wasn't answering his calls.
Yeah. And but we do. Look. I think looking at that and. There's so many reasons I think that we ended up losing that game, the Champions League final, quite beyond the refereeing decision. There were mistakes made even in the preparation, I'm sure. But yeah, I'll ask one final question about Poch. Let's take off the table the fact that perhaps in hindsight we believe that he should have, him and the club should have parted ways after that final. He takes on the next season. He takes on, as you quite rightly said, Milo, the biggest hangover that it would be possible to have as a Tottenham Hotspur manager. Do we believe that he should have been given more time? Had he got enough in the bank to earn that time? Did he deserve more time?
I think one of the other themes of this decade is because of the relative success that we gained, the supporters had very, very different expectations then. And I think that if you had ever said, look, we need to ride out the storm here, this is the bloke that we want to lead the team going on into the future, we might just have to put up with finishing 9th this season, that probably not many people would have taken that at that point, because Tottenham Hotspur by 2019 was very different to Tottenham Hotspur in 2009.
I think he was spent. I think he needed to move on. I think he needed a break from football. He needed a break from us. So, yeah, maybe he could have ridden it out. What we've got to bear in mind, actually, is that a month or so after he was sacked, COVID happened. And if he'd had another 4 months, he would have had 2 months with the, off and time to work with the players before the season started. So, we talk again about kind of closing doors moments. Maybe COVID would have given Poch the break he needed and the chance to work with the players and refocus us. And who knows?
I've never thought about that until you just brought it up. And it is such a good point, because he would have then had a season in empty stadiums where, that teams doubtless got a better break from things such as social media bullshit and whatever else, because there just weren't fans in the stadium. You're so right. I hadn't even thought of that. And it actually, unfortunately for anyone.
That's the next decade, so we can't start talking about that.
No, I'm not going there. No, I promise I won't go there.
We'll come back and do that in 8 years' time.
No, I won't sully that. But what I am going to say is it sort of reverses my conclusion as to whether, you should have said, because I'd sort of come round to the belief like, okay, probably had to happen, albeit I will always believe that he had the currency in the bank and deserved the support from the club and the supporters. I mean, I think he'd earned it and I think he should have got it. Unequivocally, I do. But I have bent to seeing that there is a logical side to it, albeit the problem is, Milo, you talked about people whispering in ears. The person who whispered in his ear at that time, which I promised you I wouldn't get into at the end of this pod, and I will maintain that promise because I won't mention the name, but could it have been anybody else? I mean, anybody else would have been better.
I do wonder actually also with Poch, I mean, Gareth mentioned early on about his kind of loyalty to his backroom staff. Yeah, if you look at Ferguson was very smart at bringing in new assistant managers and shaking things up and changing things. And I wonder if Poch had been able to do that. Is that essential in order to be a long-serving manager, in order to change things up? And, even with Conte now, we see that, he's not set, we've had different people coming in and different voices, and maybe that was required, and Poch just doesn't work that way, and maybe that will stop him being a manager who can do decades at a club. Or
it's a point to ponder, and look, I mean, frankly, it's something that will probably end up being a topic we discuss on another pod, because I think it's worthy of a bigger discussion than we're going to be able to get into here. And I think it certainly is a question that you do have to raise in this situation, along with several other things with Poch. I mean, over what distance from the Poch era has given me is the ability to maybe distance myself from my obsession with him, and it will always be slightly an obsessive because of everything that you so succinctly said about 10 minutes ago, Milo, which I can't top. I can't top that. I think of the 10s. We were talking about preparing this episode. We looked at it. We talked about Harry Redknapp. We talked about AVB. They were all just, they're stepping stones for me to getting to this man and what he did for us. And we get to a question that you put in the notes quite late, which I think is so important. Does the lack of trophies during the decade take the shine off of it?
I think it does if you're active on social media and you listen to all the nonsense that comes across from fans of other clubs. I mean, the problem with winning a trophy is it's who else is out there. So of 30 trophies, domestic trophies that were available during the decade, 22 of them were won between Manchester City, Chelsea and Manchester United,
who have a couple of bob.
So there's very, very little opportunity. And in fact, Arsenal won 3 FA Cups and Liverpool and Liverpool won some trophies in there as well. So there's not actually much up for grabs. I mean, of course, there were some missed opportunities, but you think the finals that we got into, 2015 League Cup final against Chelsea, Mourinho's Chelsea that won the league, the 2019 Champions League final against the Liverpool team that would go on to smash the league the following season. Even when we got to semi-finals, I mean, Portsmouth was the decade before, which was the one that we all get angry about. But 2012, we lost to Chelsea, won the Champions League final. We lost to Chelsea again in 2017. So it does seem to be, it's not like Arsenal who managed to get through to the finals and play Wigan, Reading, Hull and Aston Villa's.
Thank you for articulating that clearly, because it's an important point.
For me, the journey is more important than the destination, and the journey was really good. I think you've also got to recognise that during the last 30 years, since the Champions League was established and multiple clubs were qualifying for it from each league, that finishing in the top 4 is worth more than the domestic cups, and that completely skews things. And what Poch was very, very good at is qualifying for the Champions League. And realistically, when he sat down with Levy at the beginning of the season, they talked about their priorities. The priority was finishing in the top 4. It wasn't winning the League Cup. And he delivered on that. And, as fans, we might not like that because we like a day out at Wembley. We like to see us lifting silverware. Of course we do. But those weren't the club's priorities. And he delivered.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of journeys and destinations, Milo and I are sitting across from each other and waiting for the tea lady to bring the tea and biscuits as we are on this incredible odyssey and don't really care where the train is going. It doesn't matter because we're feeling it. I felt it. The only trophy that I regret not winning during this time, the decade, and specifically maybe the Poch era, was the Champions League itself, because I felt that his time and tenure deserved it, and I felt that we were unequivocally robbed of the chance to play the game properly by a terrible decision. So that I regret, but philosophically speaking, I couldn't give a shit. He made me proud to be a Tottenham Hotspur supporter again. I walked everywhere with pride, knowing that this man was leading our club and had given us our family back.
Yeah, would winning the League Cup felt better than Amsterdam? I don't think it would.
No,
I don't think so. And I think historically, we won the League Cup in 2008. Our two best players in that team were Robbie Keane and Berbatov, and they both buggered off within 3 months. In 1999, when we won the League Cup, Sol Campbell stuck around for another 2 years. He was our best player. Even 91, Gascoigne and Lineker didn't play for another 12 months. Only played for us another 12 months after that final. So winning a trophy does nothing for your long-term sustainability and long-term trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, let's just wrap this up. We could spend another hour, I feel, talking about the philosophy behind why Poch era Spurs was such a wonderful time. But let's try and hone it down. It will be the final question of this pod. It's going to be the toughest one, really, I think, chaps, given how many amazing games we did see from 2010 onwards. I'd like to know your best moment on the pitch of the 10s and, your worst moment of the 10s. What, you take it in whichever order you want. Milo, why don't you kick off?
So the best moment was Amsterdam, Ajax, and the worst moment was the hangover. That slow death of Pochettino's time as our manager was just painful.
For me, the best moment was Harry Kane's looping header in the North London derby to beat them 2-1 in February 2015. And the reason why, apart from the fact it's a winning goal against Arsenal, it just felt that was the start of a new era. So Kane was very much the spearhead of that Pochettino team, and to have beaten Arsenal in that manner was euphoric. I can still remember it. It still gives me goosebumps thinking about that split-second silence of the ball hitting the net and the crowd erupting to it. It's not the best goal he's ever scored against Arsenal, but for me, what it symbolised about where the club was going to was really important. It's hard to overlook what Milo said about the worst moment, because it felt like if that was the start of the era, then that Champions League final was very much the end of it.
Before I go in, Milo, I feel that you should have one more crack and maybe one more greatest moment, because I can't keep myself to one. And Gareth, I know that you've just said one more. Go on.
The other one. I think the mark of a great moment is when you walk into work the next day 2 foot taller. And Taxi for Macon was just what a night. And I think we all kind of basked in that for a fair while afterwards, didn't we?
That was big. I mean, look, I think so tough, really. I mean, there's Real Madrid spanking them, and great games. I'm going to go with Chelsea at home. The 2-0 win is one. Dele's 2 great goals, showing that we really were, we were continuing and we were going to be real, and we were real. I guess I don't really know how to articulate it. Amsterdam, I still, to this day, if I'm feeling a little down, I still watch the final 2 or 3 minutes. As a matter of fact, when we conclude recording, I know that the next thing I'm going to be doing is watching that final 2 minutes again. And it's not just the goal, it's the 10 minutes of celebration afterwards. It's all of it, The worst moment, I've said this many times, about my time at that final. It was the best of times, the worst of times, right? Depending on whether it was before kickoff or at the end of the game. But I'm going to pick the second 45 minutes against Bayern Munich in the Champions League as probably the worst and saddest moment for me, because we'd played so well in that first half, and I remember thinking, you fucking see, he's still got it. He's going to get this team working. We saw Ndombele really, really playing a great game, and you're just like, it's going to happen again. And then walking out, Johnny and I were looking at each other, speechless, and it was the first time we uttered the words, "Is it time?" and it was heartbreaking, a heartbreaking 45 minutes. So I'm going to say that was maybe, I mean, the Champions League stands obviously, but that would be my worst moment. But let's not stand on a worst moment. I mean, let's celebrate the fact that, you know, the tens it's been a pretty amazing decade overall, hasn't it? I mean, it was an amazing decade for us.
It's the journey, not the destination, Steff, and it was one hell of a journey.
That's right.
Well, I think what I really enjoy about, and I've written this in my notes beforehand, but for me, the phrase that sums up Spurs in that decade is the challenger club. So we actually went from being a club that made that next step, that step that was impossible. You said right at the start, Milo, that it was a bit of almost a cartel for those Champions League spots going into the decade, Arsenal, United, Chelsea and Liverpool. And we dragged ourselves into that position where we could challenge for that as well, despite the fact that Man City had been bankrolled as well. And we ended the decade. You think just going on that journey from picking a manager from sort of mid-table Southampton to going to a point where you were appointing effectively the most famous manager in the world at the time, going from a 36,000 stadium to a 62,000 one, even going from Under Armour to Nike, I think is symbolic of that journey that the club went on.
Mm. Yeah, I just have to throw this in as well. I mean, we're a pod that loves to make a musical analogy. I mean, when I think of the energy and joy that I felt with this whole period, and especially the Poch period, I mean, the man will always be somewhat of a deity to me, actually. But I think of, I remember Born Slippy coming out, and I remember it catching my ear, and I remember it catching my body and vibe, and I remember, it's 96, right? And I just remember that song, especially where it was placed in the film several times. It was just such a joyful, pumping, like, just the energy of that is probably the musical way I would articulate the joy and happiness and energy that, you know, this sport. I have to stop. That's it. I think a tear might pop into my eye if I carry on. Look, that was tremendous. I love these. I love these decades. I love these decades when we get into them, and I like getting into the nooks and crannies as we do. And thanks very much, lads. That was great. That was great. We'll add links to Spurs in the 90s and noughties episode in the show notes. Go back and listen to them because they are good. They really are. They're fun. And dear listener, it's going to get even better with The Game Is About Glory this holiday season, as we'll be back next week with a surprise Christmas special. And trust me, it is a corker, a cracker, whatever adjective you want to use. It's brilliant. It might also be one that your non-Spurs family will enjoy. So bring them aboard, play our pod for them. You know, gather them all around after the King's speech, which that sounds pretty weird, doesn't it? Especially for you, Milo, because I know that you'd never watch it anyway. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely good. So anyway, tune in for the fun. It's going to be a good one. Indeed, if you like our pod, just look, we say this every week. Tell your friends, tell your friends' friends. Just help us get our name even more out there. Leave 5-star reviews everywhere and tell everyone how brilliant we are. That's our holiday wish. So deliver it. And as always, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next year.
Next week.
I was trying to be clever, but I failed miserably, didn't I?
Yeah.
Let's just leave it there, shall we? The
next one's out on Christmas Eve.
Another miserable failure of my inability to understand calendars and times. There we go. Revealed for all. See you next week. Bye.